Ashes in their hands. The forgotten women of war. The weight of ashes. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that survival often meant carrying ashes in their hands, literally and symbolically. Ashes of homes burned to the ground, of letters turned to smoke, of bread crumbled into dust before it reached a child's mouth. But also ashes of memory, of names unspoken, of futures extinguished before they could become. Women held these ashes because no one else would. They bore them with trembling fingers, hiding them in aprons, cupping them as though warmth might still be found within. I remember my grandmother standing once by the fireplace, running her hand through grey powder that had once been wood. She said, "Everything turns to this if you wait long enough." At the time, I thought she meant only the fire. Later, I realized she was speaking of her life, of villages, of faces, of songs that had all crumbled into the same dust. Her scar was not in burns upon her skin, but in the way she could never look at ash without remembering. The truth they don't tell is that ashes were both endings and beginnings. Women scooped them from stoves to fertilize gardens, spreading grey over blackened soil in hopes that something might still grow. They mixed them with water to scrub wounds, with soap to wash clothes, with silence to bury the unbearable. Their scars were written in these acts of transformation, the defiance of turning ruin into resource. I once read of a woman who returned to her burned house and gathered ashes into a jar. She carried it with her for years, saying, "This is all that's left of the place where I was born." That jar was not just a container. It was her memory, her grief, her proof that she had belonged somewhere before the world erased it. Her scar was the weight of carrying home in dust. Children played in ashes too, though they did not understand. They smeared grey across their faces, drew symbols on floors blackened by fire. For them, it was a game. For their mothers, it was unbearable to watch. The scars lived in those contrasts. Innocence finding play in ruins, survival disguising grief. The truth they don't tell is that ashes stuck to skin long after fires went out. Women woke with black beneath their nails, grey clinging to hems of skirts, soot embedded in the lines of their palms. They carried it without choice, as if ash itself had chosen them. Their scars were not only visible but tactile, the feeling of dust that could never be fully washed away. I remember my mother once scrubbing her hands raw after a fire had consumed part of her village. She said she could not bear the smell, the way ash clung even when water washed it away. "It isn't dirt," she whispered. "It's memory." Her scar was in her hands, skin cracked not from labor alone, but from trying to erase the unerasable. The truth they don't tell is that ashes were sometimes sacred. Women kept handfuls from homes, from altars, from burned books. They treated them as relics, burying them in small boxes, scattering them in rivers, pressing them into the soil where new seeds would be planted. These were not only rituals of grief, but of survival. Their scars lived in the sacredness of dust, in the reverence for what had been lost. I once stood in a ruined church where women had gathered the ashes of hymnals burned by soldiers. They placed them in jars, sealed them, and kept them hidden for decades. When asked why, one woman said, "Because they tried to burn our voices. This way we kept them." Her scar was defiance itself, carried in powdery silence. Ashes in their hands remind us that survival is not clean, not shining, not triumphant. It is grey, fragile, dissolving. It is the act of holding what remains when everything else is gone. Women bore that weight unseen, forgotten, erased from history. But the ashes remain, in jars, in soil, in memory. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that even when the world turned away, they carried ashes forward. Not because they wanted to, but because someone had to. And in their hands, fragile and trembling, those ashes became the seeds of memory, proof that even destruction could not silence them completely. The jar of dust, the truth they don't tell about women in war zones, is that memory sometimes fits inside a jar. When flames consumed homes, when walls collapsed, when nothing remained but fragments of bone and soot, Women bent down, scooped ashes with their bare hands, and placed them in glass containers. They sealed them tightly, as if to capture time itself, as if dust could speak in silence. To outsiders, it was meaningless gray powder. To them, it was a relic, a shrine, a story condensed into fragments. I remember my grandmother keeping a small jar wrapped in cloth at the back of a wooden drawer. For years, I thought it was only dirt. One evening, she touched it gently, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "This is my house." In that moment, I understood. The jar was her anchor, proof that what had been burned still existed in some form. Her scar was not only in what she had lost, but in what she was forced to preserve in silence. The truth they don't tell is that women filled jars with ashes of burned letters, with fragments of bread too charred to eat, with dust from altars where they once prayed. These jars were not symbols of despair, but of refusal to let memory vanish completely. Their scars lived in these fragile reliquaries, in glass that could shatter as easily as hope. I once read of a woman who carried such a jar across borders. She hid it in her clothing as she fled, clutching it tighter than food, tighter than blankets. When asked why, she said, "Because everything else can be replaced, but this cannot." Her scar was not only exile, but the weight of carrying her world reduced to dust. Children sometimes discovered these jars and asked questions. "What is inside?" they would whisper. Mothers hesitated, torn between truth and silence. Some answered plainly, "This is all that's left." Others invented gentler lies, saying the dust was magic, that it protected them. Their scars were in those moments, in deciding whether to pass on grief or shield innocence with imagination. The truth they don't tell is that these jars became altars. Women lit candles beside them, placed flowers on their lids, touched them in prayer. They treated dust as sacred, because it was all that remained of love, of belonging, of home. Their scars were in those rituals, repeated in shadows, unseen by history. I remember my mother polishing the outside of a jar as though it were glassware for guests. She never opened it, never let us touch it. Only years later did she admit it held ashes from her childhood home, burned in a single night. "I had nothing else to keep," she said. Her scar was the tenderness she gave to dust, treating absence as though it were treasure. The truth they don't tell is that jars of dust carried contradictions. They were heavy with grief, yet fragile in form, sacred yet ordinary, worthless to outsiders, yet priceless to the women who guarded them. To carry one was to hold a paradox, proof of destruction, proof of memory, proof of survival. Their scars were the contradictions themselves, the type dissonance between what the world dismissed and what they cherished. Once saw a display in a memorial site where jars filled with ashes from destroyed villages were lined on shelves. Each was labeled with a name, a town, a family, a date. The silence in that room was unbearable. It felt as though the jars themselves were breathing, whispering, mourning. They were not only dust, they were lives condensed, testimonies sealed. The truth they don't tell is that some women never let go of these jars, even when offered new homes, new furniture, new futures. They placed them on mantels in modern apartments, hiding them behind photographs, carrying the past into every room. Their scars were the division of living two lives, one in the present, one forever sealed in glass. The jar of dust reminds us that survival is not always carried in bodies or in words. Sometimes it is carried in small containers hidden from sight, fragile as memory itself. Women bore these jars because the world had turned away, because history would not record their names, because silence demanded a vessel. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that even when all was reduced to ashes, they found ways to preserve. They cupped dust in their palms, poured it into jars, sealed it with trembling hands. And though forgotten by the world, those jars remain, silent witnesses, fragile archives, scars of glass and ash that whisper still. The bread made of ash. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that hunger could turn even ash into bread. Women bent over ruined stoves, scraping the last handfuls of flour, mixing it with water that smelled of rust, kneading dough with trembling hands. And when the flames burned too hot, when bread collapsed into blackened crust, they did not throw it away. They brushed off the ashes and placed it before their children, whispering, "Eat." Survival was bitter, dry, covered in soot, but it was survival. I remember my grandmother telling me that she could never forget the taste of ash in her mouth. Even when food returned, she said, I could still taste the war. Her scar was not only hunger, but the way memory clung to her tongue, reminding her of every day when eating meant swallowing smoke. The truth they don't tell is that bread became more than food. It was a symbol of defiance, a small triumph carved out of absence. Women kneaded prayers into the dough, promises into the crust. They broke loaves like rituals, distributing pieces carefully, ensuring every child received something. Their scars were not only in hunger, but in the guilt of deciding who ate more and who went with less. I once read of a woman who mixed ground acorns and ashes into dough when flour ran out. She said, "It was poison to the body, but it gave us one more day." Her scar was not only the damage left inside her, but the memory that she had fed her children dust to keep them alive. Children learned to chew slowly, to swallow without complaint. They learned to pretend the bitterness was sweetness, to smile when their mothers looked at them, to say thank you, even when their stomachs remained hollow. Their scars were formed in that discipline. In growing up too early, learning gratitude in hunger, the truth they don't tell is that women burned their own share so their children might eat clean crusts. They ate blackened scraps in silence, wiping their mouths before anyone saw. They told no one, carried the bitterness alone. Their scars were the quiet sacrifices that no one remembered, the smoke they swallowed so others would not. I remember my mother once burning bread intentionally. When I asked why, she said, "Because then I can eat it without guilt. The good pieces go to you." I didn't understand until years later. Her scar was not in the ash itself, but in the act of making herself invisible in the name of love. The truth they don't tell is that bread became ritual. Women prayed as they mixed, crossed themselves before stoves, kissed burned loaves before breaking them apart. Each act was both survival and remembrance, both faith and resignation. Their scars were carved in these gestures, repeated every day with trembling hands. I once saw in a war archive a loaf of preserved black bread, hardened to stone. The label read, "Last bread of the winter, 1942. Standing before it, I imagined the hands that had shaped it, the mouths that had swallowed ash and silence. That bread was more than food. It was testimony, a scar baked into crust. The truth they don't tell is that women carried the memory of burned bread long after hunger ended. They could not throw away food, could not bear the sight of waste. They saved crumbs, stored leftovers, hid scraps in pockets. Their scars were not only visible in stories, but in habits passed down silently to children who never knew war. The bread made of ash reminds us that survival is not glorious, is bitter, fragile, imperfect. It is the act of eating what should be thrown away, of transforming ruin into nourishment. Women bore this burden in silence, forgotten by history, but their scars remain in the taste of ash, a flavor that speaks louder than any words. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they fed life with ashes. They baked tomorrow into blackened crusts, carried hunger in their bodies so others might live. And though forgotten, the memory of that bread remains, burned, bitter, and sacred, the ashes beneath fingernails. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that ashes did not remain in stoves or on ruins alone. They clung to skin, buried themselves beneath fingernails, lodged in creases of palms. Women carried them without choice, fragments of destruction pressed into their flesh. No amount of scrubbing, no cold water from rivers, no sand rubbed raw against hands could erase them. They lived with dust inside their bodies, walking archives of everything the fire had devoured. I remember my grandmother soaking her hands in a basin, scrubbing until her skin was raw. When I asked why, she whispered, "Because they smell of yesterday." What she meant was that ash had memory. It carried the weight of places she could never return to. Her scar was not in burns, but in the invisible stain that never left. The truth they don't tell is that women's nails became tiny cemeteries. Under them lodged fragments of burned wood, strands of fabric turned to dust, even bits of bone they could not name. They worked with these hands, kneading bread, braiding hair, digging graves. Their scars lived in the knowledge that no matter what they touched, ruin clung to them. I once read of a woman who said she would never paint her nails again. "Why cover them with color?" she asked, "when I know what lies beneath?" For her, beauty was impossible. Every gesture carried the memory of ashes. Her scar was the denial of adornment, the refusal to pretend her hands had not been marked by history. Children noticed too. They traced their mother's nails, asked about the gray that never vanished. Some were told gentle lies, "It is only dust from the fields." Others were told the truth, "It is what remains of home." Their scars were in those explanations. In growing up, knowing their mothers' bodies bore the ruins of everything they had lost. The truth they don't tell is that ashes beneath nails became symbols of work, of endless labor. Women shoveled rubble, dragged wood, carried buckets of water, always with dust pressed deep into flesh. They looked at their hands and saw not themselves, but the ruins they could not escape. Their scars were visible not only in exhaustion, but in the mirror of their own skin. I remember my mother sitting silently after a long day, staring at her hands. She scraped at her nails with a knife, frustrated. Finally, she whispered, "They will never be clean." That sentence haunted me more than anything else she said. Her scar was not in her body alone, but in the despair of permanence. The truth they don't tell is that some women grew to accept the ashes. They stopped trying to wash them away, treating them as part of their flesh. They said, "Better to carry them than to forget." Their scars were in that surrender, in turning destruction into identity. I once stood in a cemetery where women pressed their hands into the soil after burying the dead. When they pulled them back, their nails were filled with earth and ash. They looked at each other silently, then walked away without washing. It was not filth. It was memory. The truth they don't tell is that ashes beneath fingernails became proof of survival. They testified silently, "I was there. I touched what burned. I carried what the world tried to erase." These scars were not written in books, not preserved in archives. They lived in bodies, in the smallest details of hands. The ashes beneath fingernails remind us that survival is not clean. It is dirty, embedded, inescapable. Women carried it with them even into new lives, even into peace. They touched their children, cooked meals, built homes, always with traces of yesterday hiding in their flesh. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they carried history beneath their nails. Invisible, unwanted, permanent, but real. And in those hidden scars, the past refused to be forgotten. The smoke that stayed in their hair. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that smoke lingers long after the fire has gone out. It does not simply vanish into air. It clings, it weaves itself into strands of hair. It buries itself in fabric, it follows them into every room. Women lived with the scent of destruction on their bodies. They carried it like a second skin, a perfume of grief that no water, no soap, no time could erase. I remember my grandmother braiding her hair in silence. I asked once why she always tied it so tightly. She said, "Because if it moves, the smell returns." She believed that binding it was the only way to silence the smoke. Her scar was not only in what her hair carried, but in how she carried herself, bound, restrained, always trying to keep grief under control. The truth they don't tell is that women washed their hair in rivers, in buckets, in rainwater collected in pans. They scrubbed until their scalps burned, until their fingernails tore skin. Yet still, when wind shifted, the smell returned. It was not only odor, it was memory. It was presence of fire embedded deeper than strands. Their scars were in this endless scrubbing, this war against an enemy that refused to leave. I once read of a woman who cut all her hair off after her village burned. She said, "I could not bear to carry the smoke any longer." For her, hair was not beauty, not identity, but a burden. Her scar was the sacrifice of self to escape the memory of ash. Children noticed too. They pressed their faces into their mothers' necks, inhaling what they thought was simply the scent of home. But as they grew older, they recognized it for what it was, the residue of fire, the presence of ruins. Their scars were born not only of hunger or fear, but of breathing grief into their lungs before they even had words to name it. The truth they don't tell is that women's hair became a tapestry of survival. It carried soot from collapsed roofs, dust from charred wood, sparks from flames that nearly devoured them. Each strand was both a thread of identity and a thread of history. They tied their hair back while burying the dead, let it fall over their shoulders while hiding in cellars, cut it short to resist lice, shaved it entirely in despair. Their scars lived in those choices, in the ways survival reshaped even their sense of self. I remember my mother's hair always smelling faintly of smoke, even in times of peace. It was as if the scent had chosen her, refusing to release its grip. She said, "Even when I walked in fields of flowers, I still carried the fire." Her scar was not in flames that touched her body, but in the invisible weight she bore, a fragrance of destruction woven into her. The truth they don't tell is that hair became a measure of time. Women knew how long the war had lasted, by how often they had to cut their children's hair with blunt scissors, by how much grey appeared in their own braids, by how many times smoke returned even after scrubbing. Each strand grew in defiance, yet each carried ashes. Their scars were written in those strands, a calendar of survival marked not in months, but in soot. I once read of women in refugee camps who wove their hair together into ropes, binding themselves physically so that no child would wander off in the night. Those ropes carried both smoke and love. Their scar was the paradox, destruction woven side by side with protection. The truth they don't tell is that even in intimacy, the smoke remained. Husbands who returned leaned close and smelled not perfume, not flowers, not warmth, but fire. Women tried to cover it with oils, with herbs, with cloth soaked in lavender, but still it lingered. Their scars were in those moments of shame, when they realized that even their own bodies betrayed memory. I remember my grandmother once standing in the wind, her hair loose for the first time. Smoke lifted from it like a shadow. She whispered, "I thought I'd left it behind." Her scar was the realization that some fires never extinguish. They only move from the world into the body. The truth they don't tell is that when peace came, smoke did not vanish. It lived in closets where old dresses still carried it, in pillows that whispered of burning, in hair that no amount of washing could cleanse. Women lived with the scent of destruction until their last days, carrying war into spaces where silence should have been. The smoke that stayed in their hair reminds us that survival is not only scars on skin, but in the invisible traces that linger. Women bore this burden in silence, forgotten by history, unseen by those who never leaned close enough to smell it. Yet their bodies carried testimony in every strand. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, the fires followed them. Not as flames, but as fragrance, as residue, as memory woven into their hair. And though the world forgot, the smoke remained, whispering through strands, telling stories no one asked to hear, the ashes in their voices. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that ashes did not remain in ruins, in jars, or in hair alone. They settled in voices too. Words carried the weight of soot. Songs cracked under smoke. Prayers turned hoarse, rasping like embers that refused to die out. Women spoke, but the world rarely heard the fire hidden in their throats. I remember my grandmother's voice, low and rough, as though it had been shaped not by years but by smoke itself. When I asked why she never sang, she answered, "Because the air in my chest belongs to another time." Her scar was not silence alone, but the residue of flames that had burned her voice into something unrecognizable. The truth they don't tell is that women swallowed too much smoke during bombings, too many cries in cellars, too many nights whispering into ashes. Their voices never fully returned. They coughed mid-sentence, cracked mid-prayer, broke mid-lullaby. Their scars were in those interruptions, reminders that even breath was fragile. I once read of a woman who led children through a night of bombardment by singing. Her song was jagged, her voice torn, but it kept them calm. When the night ended, she never sang again. She said, "The ashes stayed in me." Her scar was that one song, both salvation and farewell. Children learned to read their mother's voices like maps. A low whisper meant danger. A forced calm meant hunger was near. A single sharp word meant silence was necessary. Their survival depended not on what was spoken, but on how it was spoken. Their scars were born from this code, from growing up fluent in the language of fear. The truth they don't tell is that women used their voices sparingly, as though every word cost life itself. They rationed speech like food, offering it only when necessary. They taught children to save their breath, to hide their laughter, to silence their sobs. Their scars were the swallowed words, conversations that never existed, stories never told. I remember my mother praying so softly it seemed her lips moved without sound. She said, "God does not need volume. He only needs memory." Her scar was in that faith, believing even prayer had to shrink under the weight of ashes. The truth they don't tell is that laughter was the most fragile sound of all. When it slipped through, it startled even those who created it. Women laughed rarely, and when they did, it came out cracked, brittle, as though smoke had stolen its strength. Their scars were in that broken joy, proof that even lightness was scarred by fire. I once heard a recording of a woman decades after the war. Her voice trembled, rasped, faltered. She said, "I used to sing every morning. After the fire, I only whispered." Her words carried more than memory. They carried residue, ashes lingering in breath. The truth they don't tell is that voices were also vessels of defiance. Women whispered truths in hidden corners, passed warnings from one to another, told children stories to keep hope alive. Even when scarred, their voices carried survival. Their scars lived in every syllable, fragile, fractured, but alive. The ashes in their voices remind us that survival was not only carried in hands, jars, or hair, but in sound itself. Women bore this scar in their throats, speaking with echoes of fires the world had long forgotten. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they still spoke through hoarseness, through whispers, through voices scarred by ash. And though faint, those voices remain, carrying memory in every broken note, the ashes in their eyes. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that ashes did not only cling to hands, hair, or voices, they also lived in eyes. Smoke darkened their gaze, grief turned pupils heavy, and silence gathered like dust across irises. When the world looked at them, it saw tiredness. But behind that tiredness lived entire ruins, entire villages, entire histories, compressed into a single stare. I remember my grandmother's eyes, grey like storm clouds, always carrying a dim reflection of fire. She never looked straight into mirrors. She said, "They show me what I lost, not who I am." Her scar was not in blindness, but in the unbearable visibility of memory every time she opened her eyes. The truth they don't tell is that women's eyes memorized too much. They carried the shape of roads lined with corpses, the color of houses turned to ash, the glow of flames eating through the night. Even when decades passed, they could recall details in terrifying clarity. Their scars were in that memory. Photographs burned into their vision with no way to fade. I once read of a woman who, whenever she closed her eyes, saw a barn on fire where her family had been trapped. She said, "Sleep is worse than waking. At least when I am awake, I can choose where I look." Her scar was in the cruel permanence of sight, memory forcing itself even behind closed lids. Children noticed too. They said their mother's eyes looked older than their faces. Some avoided those gazes, frightened by the shadows in them. Others clung to them, finding a strange comfort in the steadiness of eyes that had already seen the worst. Their scars were shaped by this inheritance, learning to recognize survival and despair in a single glance. The truth they don't tell is that women's eyes also learned silence. They communicated with each other across ruined streets without words, a warning glance, a flicker of reassurance, a flash of grief. Entire conversations passed in seconds. Their scars were carried in those silent exchanges, the knowledge that language could be reduced to nothing more than a look. I remember my mother watching me while I slept. Her gaze was heavy, unblinking. When I asked her why she stared, she said, "Because I never know if morning will come for you." Her scar was not only in her fear, but in the exhaustion of carrying vigilance inside her eyes. The truth they don't tell is that ashes made eyes fragile. Some women lost sight from smoke, others from tears that burned too long. They rubbed until redness became permanent, until vision blurred. Their scars were in the dimming of light, in the way the world grew hazy not from age, but from grief. I once saw a photograph of a woman taken after the liberation of her town. Her body stood upright, but her eyes looked somewhere else, far away, into a past no one else could see. That photograph became famous, but few asked what she was seeing in that moment. Her scar lived in the invisibility of her vision, trapped inside her gaze. The truth they don't tell is that women carried hope in their eyes too. Even amid ashes, their pupils reflected flickers of dawn, of children's laughter, of seeds sprouting where rubble had been. Their scars were not only in sorrow, but in the burden of holding on to light when darkness demanded surrender. The ashes in their eyes remind us that survival is visible, even when unspoken. It is carved into stares that pierce, that haunt, that remember. Women bore this scar in silence, their eyes carrying more history than any book ever could. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, their eyes never closed. They remained open, heavy with dust and memory, refusing to forget even when forgetting would have been easier. And in those ashes, their eyes still speak, unflinching, unbroken, alive, the ashes in their silence. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that silence itself became a graveyard of ashes. Every unsaid word, every stifled cry, every prayer swallowed before reaching the air, all of it settled inside them like soot at the bottom of a chimney. Their silence was not emptiness, it was weight. It was residue. It was survival written in the absence of sound. I remember my grandmother sitting by the window, lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. She rarely raised her voice, rarely even whispered. When I asked her once why she was so quiet, she answered, "Because silence is the only thing they cannot take from me." Her scar was in the discipline of withholding, in turning ash into armor. The truth they don't tell is that silence was both protection and prison. Women silenced their children in cellars, covering mouths with trembling palms. They silenced themselves before soldiers, swallowing screams as homes collapsed. They silenced grief, lest it betray their hiding places. Their scars lived in these sacrifices, in the soundlessness that both saved and suffocated them. I once read of a woman who said she had not spoken her husband's name for 20 years. "If I say it aloud," she explained, "it will turn to ash again." Her scar was the unspoken love, preserved in silence, kept alive but unacknowledged. Children inherited silence like a second language. They learned to move without footsteps, to communicate with glances, to suppress laughter even in play. For them, silence was not absence but instruction. Their scars were written in their hesitation to speak, in their mistrust of their own voices, long after the war was gone. The truth they don't tell is that silence reshaped women's bodies. Shoulders curved inward from holding cries, chests ached from breaths held too long, throats burned from unshed words. Their scars were written in posture, in breath, in the physical toll of unspoken life. I remember my mother saying, "Silence was heavier than hunger." She explained that hunger gnawed at the stomach, but silence devoured the soul. Her scar was the hollowness she carried inside, where words should have lived but never grew. The truth they don't tell is that silence was not only imposed, but chosen. Women chose not to tell their stories, not to share their grief, not to speak of what had broken them. They feared disbelief, feared reopening wounds, feared losing the fragile ground they had rebuilt. Their scars lived in that choice, the decision to bury memory beneath layers of quiet. I once visited a memorial where a plaque read simply, "For those who never spoke." No names, no dates, no stories. Just silence carved into stone. It felt heavier than any list of the dead, because it carried all that would never be told. The truth they don't tell is that silence also preserved dignity. Women refused to confess humiliations, refused to describe violence, refused to let the world feast on their suffering. Their silence was not weakness, but defiance, a refusal to give history what it demanded. Their scars were in the strength of withholding, in the ashes they chose to keep hidden. The ashes in their silence remind us that survival is not always shouted, not always sung. Sometimes it is whispered only in dreams, carried in breath, hidden in the folds of memory. Women bore this silence like a tomb within them. Unseen yet unshakable, the truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they became living cemeteries of silence. They carried ashes not in urns, not in jars, but in their throats, in their hearts, in their refusal to speak. And though forgotten, their silence remains, an echo louder than words, a scar carved in the absence of sound, the ashes in their hands. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that their hands became vessels of memory, carrying ashes not only as residue of fire, but as testimony. They scooped what remained of homes, pressed ashes into cloth bundles, smeared soot across foreheads in grief. Their palms became altars, both fragile and sacred, cradling what the world had reduced to dust. I remember my grandmother showing me her hands, rough, cracked, the skin always dry. She said they held more than they were meant to. What she meant was not babies or bread or work alone. She meant ashes. Ashes of rooms that no longer stood, of names whispered into smoke, of days that had crumbled in her grip. Her scar was not only in her hands, but in the invisible weight they had carried. The truth they don't tell is that women often chose to keep ashes close instead of letting them scatter. They cupped them as though holding life, refusing to let the wind claim them. Their hands shook, their skin blackened, but still they clung. Their scars were written in the trembling, in the refusal to release what had already been lost. I once read of a woman who walked miles with a handful of ashes pressed against her chest. When asked why she didn't use a bag, she answered, "Because they must feel my heartbeat." Her scar was devotion, carved into survival, the belief that love required her hands as guardians. Children saw these gestures and imitated them. They carried dirt, pebbles, fragments of rubble, pretending it was memory too. For them it was play. For their mothers it was unbearable. Their scars lived in that contrast, innocence echoing grief without knowing. The truth they don't tell is that ashes burned the skin. Women carried them even when they blistered, even when their palms cracked open. They bore the pain in silence, as though punishment was part of love. Their scars remained etched in flesh long after the soot had gone. I remember my mother washing her hands again and again, yet always looking down as though something still remained. She once whispered, "They never leave you." Her scar was not dirt, but memory, the phantom weight of what her hands had once held. The truth they don't tell is that hands carrying ashes also created. Women mixed dust into clay to rebuild ovens, pressed grey into mortar to patch walls, scattered it in fields to nourish soil. Their scars were not only destruction, but transformation, the defiance of turning loss into foundation. I once stood in a village where women rebuilt homes from rubble, their palms grey with dust. They sang softly as they worked, pressing ashes into new walls. When asked why they used what had burned, one answered, "Because our dead must live in what we build." Her scar was not in grief alone, but in weaving memory into survival. The truth they don't tell is that when women opened their hands, ashes fell like sand, scattering into air. They watched fragments slip away, unable to hold everything. Their scars were in that surrender, the knowledge that no matter how tightly they gripped, some pieces would always escape. The ashes in their hands remind us that survival is tactile. It is touch, weight, texture. It is the feel of dust clinging to skin, refusing to wash away. Women bore this scar not in words but in palms, in fingers, in hands that held both ruin and rebirth. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they carried history in their hands. Fragile, trembling, grey, but alive. And though forgotten, those hands remain in memory. Always reaching, always holding, always carrying ashes the world refused to see. The ashes in their dreams. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that ashes followed them even into sleep. By day they carried jars, ruins, dust on their skin. By night, their minds filled with flames that never ended, smoke that curled through the air, faces turning to cinders. They closed their eyes to escape, but dreams betrayed them. Ashes entered their lungs in silence, even while their bodies rested. I remember my grandmother waking with a gasp, her chest heaving as though she had been running through fire. She clutched her sheets, damp with sweat, whispering it was burning again. She said it every time, as if the fire lived inside her. Her scar was not only the memory of destruction, but the way sleep itself became another battlefield. The truth they don't tell is that dreams carried voices of the dead. Women saw their children calling to them from smoke, heard husbands singing through flames, felt neighbors' hands reaching only to vanish into ash. They awoke trembling, tears streaking their cheeks, haunted by meetings that were both gift and torment. Their scars were in those visitations, the cruel mercy of reunion that dissolved at dawn. I once read of a woman who said she refused to sleep lying down. She sat upright each night, afraid that if she surrendered fully to rest, the fire in her dreams would consume her. For decades she lived like this, half awake, half asleep. Her scar was not only in her exhaustion, but in the prison of dreams she could never escape. Children noticed the nightmares too. They woke to mothers crying out, thrashing against invisible flames. Sometimes they crawled into their arms, pressing small hands to sweat-drenched faces. Other times they stayed away, afraid of eyes that opened wide in terror, unrecognizing. Their scars were shaped by those nights, learning that even dreams were unsafe. The truth they don't tell is that women tried to fight their dreams with rituals. Some placed jars of ashes beneath their pillows, believing it would keep the nightmares contained. Others recited prayers until sleep came like surrender. Some refused to close their eyes at all, working until exhaustion forced them. Their scars lived in these defenses, fragile walls against fires no one else could see. I remember my mother lighting a candle before bed, even when there was no need. She said the small flame reminded her that light could be gentle too, not only destructive. "If I dream of fire," she whispered, "let it be this one." Her scar was hope wrapped in ritual, the attempt to tame memory with a single flicker of control. The truth they don't tell is that even peace did not end these dreams. Years, decades, entire lifetimes later, women still woke in the grip of smoke. They built new homes, held grandchildren, cooked meals in kitchens filled with laughter. Yet at night the flames returned. Their scars were not bound by time. The war followed them into eternity, alive in the language of dreams. I once met an old woman who said, "My dreams are the cemetery I visit every night." She explained that in her sleep she saw the faces of everyone she lost, walking through fields of ash. Each morning she rose with red eyes, carrying grief fresh as the day it began. Her scar was in that eternal return, that nightly resurrection of ruin. The truth they don't tell is that women sometimes chose not to share these dreams. They carried them quietly, believing others would not understand. Silence became heavier than fire, yet they bore it alone. Their scars were not only the dreams themselves, but the isolation of never speaking them. The ashes in their dreams remind us that survival does not stop at waking. It seeps into the unconscious, rewriting every night into a battlefield. Women bore this scar in their sleep, unseen by the world, unrecorded by history, but alive in their trembling bodies. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, even their rest was stolen. Ashes followed them into dreams, into breath, into memory that never loosened its grip. And though forgotten, those dreams remain, silent, burning, endless. The ashes in their lullabies. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that even lullabies carried ashes. Songs meant to soothe children, to cradle them into sleep, became heavy with grief, smoke, and silence. Mothers rocked babies against chests, still trembling from explosions, whispered melodies through throats raw from smoke, sang words that cracked like firewood. Lullabies became less about comfort and more about survival, a fragile net of sound stretched across chaos. I remember my grandmother humming a tune so low it was almost inaudible. When I asked her what the song meant, she said, "It used to be about flowers. After the war, it was only about sleep." The lyrics had vanished, swallowed by fire, but the melody lingered like ash in the air. Her scar was the transformation of beauty into necessity. The truth they don't tell is that lullabies became codes. Mothers used rhythm to signal when to be quiet, used melody to mask the sounds of hunger, used silence between verses to listen for danger. Their songs carried layers of meaning invisible to the untrained ear. Their scars lived in this translation, turning music into warning, comfort into strategy. I once read of a woman who sang to her infant in a cellar as bombs fell above. Her voice cracked, her notes trembling, but the child calmed. Later she said, "I was not singing for him. I was singing to remind myself I was still alive." Her scar was not only grief, but the desperate need to anchor herself with sound. Children absorbed these lullabies differently. They grew up remembering melodies without words, fragments of tunes broken by sobs, rhythms that echoed fear more than comfort. Their scars were the inheritance of unfinished songs, lullabies that belonged more to war than to peace. The truth they don't tell is that many women stopped singing altogether. Their voices had been stolen by smoke, their hearts too heavy for melody. They rocked their children in silence, letting the rhythm of movement replace the rhythm of song. Their scars were in the silence itself, the absence of music where it should have been. I remember my mother telling me that when she finally tried to sing again, years later, her voice cracked before she reached the first note. She wept, saying, "The war still lives in my throat." Her scar was not in forgetting the song, but in losing the ability to give it life. The truth they don't tell is that lullabies themselves changed. Songs of spring turned into prayers for food, songs of love into promises of safety. Women invented verses on the spot. "Close your eyes, the night will pass. Hush now, we will live." Their scars were etched into these improvised hymns, each note a plea, each word a shield. I once stood in a refugee camp where women hummed in unison. Dozens of children pressed against their chests. The sound was eerie, low, almost like mourning, yet it carried the rhythm of survival, a lullaby not of joy, but of endurance. It was not music for sleep, it was music for life. The truth they don't tell is that even decades later, women could not hear certain songs without breaking. A simple tune in the marketplace, a melody on the radio, could open wounds they thought had healed. Their scars were alive in those moments, memory resurrected by music, grief carried in notes. The ashes in their lullabies remind us that survival was not only in food, in shelter, in silence, but in song. Even broken, even cracked, even whispered through smoke, women sang. Their voices carried both grief and defiance, rocking children into fragile peace. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they still sang. Not because their voices were strong, but because their children needed them. And though history forgets their music, the ashes remain in lullabies, fragments of melody that whisper still, carrying memory across generations, the ashes in their letters. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that letters carried ashes too. Words written on fragile paper became lifelines, prayers, confessions. Some were burned before they reached anyone, others hidden in walls, others left unsent because there was no one left to read them. Letters became both presence and absence, voices inked in desperation, silenced in fire. I remember my grandmother unfolding a piece of yellowed paper she kept in a tin box. The words were nearly erased, the edges blackened as if touched by flame. She said it was the last thing he wrote before the house burned. Her scar was not only in losing him, but in holding a letter that smelled of smoke decades later. The truth they don't tell is that women wrote even when there was no hope of delivery. They wrote to dead husbands, to vanished children, to homes that no longer stood. They poured their grief into sentences no one would ever read, sealing them with tears instead of stamps. Their scars lived in these invisible conversations, in the loneliness of unanswered words. I once read of a woman who wrote the same letter every week for 2 years, always beginning with, "We are still alive." She never mailed them. She buried them in jars beneath the floorboards. When asked why, she said, "Because if someone finds them one day, they will know we were here." Her scar was hope transformed into archive. Children discovered some of these letters by accident. They opened boxes, found scraps of paper hidden inside mattresses, or read fragments scrawled on walls. For them it was revelation, proof that their mothers had spoken more than silence. Their scars were the discovery of grief preserved in ink. The truth they don't tell is that many letters turned to ash before they could be read. Women watched smoke carry their words into the sky, love, fear, memory vanishing into grey. They stood helpless, palms open, as if trying to catch the sentences mid-air. Their scars were in that helplessness, in the destruction of the only language they had left. I remember my mother once writing for hours, then feeding the paper into the stove without hesitation. When I asked why, she said, "Because some truths are too heavy to leave behind." Her scar was not only in the act of burning, but in the decision to silence her own voice. The truth they don't tell is that letters became sacred objects. Women folded them with care, placed them beneath pillows, kissed them as though lips could bridge absence. Some carried them tucked into clothing, pressed against skin like relics. Their scars were in the devotion to fragile paper, in treating ink as though it were flesh. I once saw in a museum a display of half-burned letters, edges curled, words still visible. "Don't forget me." The room was silent. No one needed explanation. The letters themselves carried the scar, proof of lives interrupted, voices almost erased. The truth they don't tell is that women kept writing even after peace returned. They wrote letters to the dead, to the past, to themselves. They stored them in boxes, hidden from view. Their scars lived in those secret archives, testimonies too private for history, but too heavy to abandon. The ashes in their letters remind us that survival is not only carried in bodies, but in words. Even when destroyed, even when unread, letters spoke. They whispered of grief, of endurance, of memory that refused to die. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they wrote anyway. And though many letters turn to ash, their words remain in silence. Scars inked in air, fragile as paper, eternal as memory. The ashes in their songs. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that even songs carried ashes. Music, once a language of joy, became a vessel of grief. Voices that once filled kitchens and fields with laughter now trembled, hoarse, filled with soot from fires and smoke from ruins. Songs did not vanish, they changed. They became broken hymns of survival, melodies threaded with silence, refrains cracked open by tears. I remember my grandmother's voice when she sang. It was always low, almost a whisper, as though she feared the song might shatter if sung too loudly. She told me we had to sing softly so no one would hear us. But I think it was more than fear of discovery. It was the ashes lodged in her throat, the heaviness of words that could no longer rise free. Her scar was that every song sounded like mourning, even when the melody came from before the war. The truth they don't tell is that women sang to remember. They hummed fragments of lullabies while rocking children in cellars. They whispered verses of hymns while walking roads of exile. They whistled melodies that once belonged to weddings or festivals, now swallowed by silence. Each note carried memory as much as sound. Their scars were in those broken refrains, echoes of a past that would never return. I once read of a woman who carried a single song with her through the entire war. It was an old folk melody, but the words changed depending on what she needed to say. She sang it for hunger, for grief, for hope, for prayer. After the war, she confessed, "I do not remember the original lyrics anymore. The war took them." Her scar was not forgetting alone, but the way survival rewrote even her music. Children learned these songs too, though they often heard only fragments. They grew up with incomplete verses, with tunes that ended abruptly, with melodies interrupted by sobs. Their scars were in the unfinished music of their childhoods, the inheritance of broken songs. The truth they don't tell is that music itself became dangerous. A loud voice could betray a hiding place. A joyful song could be punished. Even a hum could draw attention. So women muted their own sound, carrying songs inside rather than releasing them. Their scars were in the silence of music swallowed whole. I remember my mother once trying to sing while we worked. Her voice cracked almost instantly. She stopped, pressed her lips together and whispered, "It feels like ashes when I try." Her scar was not only the silence itself, but the pain of realizing her voice no longer belonged to her. The truth they don't tell is that women's songs also became prayers. They sang not to be heard, but to endure. A single hum could keep despair away for one more night. A faint melody could cradle a child into fragile rest. Their scars lived in those whispered hymns, songs offered not to the world, but to survival itself. I once stood in a church where women had gathered after the war. They sang together, voices trembling, breaking, weaving into something almost too fragile to hold. It was not harmony, not music as the world knew it, but it carried more power than any choir. It was survival turned into sound. The truth they don't tell is that even decades later, women could not listen to music without flinching. Certain notes reopened wounds, certain instruments pulled them back into fire. Their scars were alive in these triggers, proof that ashes remained even when melodies tried to heal. The ashes in their songs remind us that survival has a sound. It is cracked, trembling, unfinished, but alive. Women bore this scar in their voices, in their music, in the fragments of melodies that carried them through nights when silence alone would have been unbearable. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they still sang, not because their voices were whole, but because silence was heavier than ash. And though history forgets their songs, the echoes remain. Broken hymns, unfinished refrains, music woven with memory and fire, the ashes in their footsteps. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that ashes were not only carried in their hands, voices or songs, they were scattered beneath their footsteps. Each road they walked was lined with ruins, each path imprinted with grey dust rising around ankles, clinging to hems of skirts, coating the soles of shoes. With every step, they left behind a faint trail of ash, as if grief itself marked their way. I remember my grandmother telling me, "We never walked on earth, we walked on memory." She meant that the soil beneath her feet was no longer only dirt. It was mixed with burned homes, broken furniture, bones turned to powder. Her scar was the realization that every journey forward crushed the past a little more beneath her feet. The truth they don't tell is that women often retrace the same paths, back and forth, searching for food, water, missing family. Every return added more layers of ash to their footsteps, more weight to their souls. They carried not only exhaustion, but the knowledge that the ground itself was heavy with loss. Their scars were etched in the rhythm of these endless journeys. Survival measured in miles of ruin. I once read of a woman who carried her infant across 30 kilometers of burned countryside. She said, "The earth burned our feet even after the fire had gone." She wrapped rags around her shoes, pressed forward, leaving trails of grey. Her scar was not only physical blisters, but the memory of every step as a negotiation with pain. Children walked alongside too, dragging small feet through the dust, sometimes leaving lines as if they had tried to draw instead of walk. They coughed on the air, choked on the smoke that lingered still. Their scars were written in those small footprints, innocents walking through landscapes of death. The truth they don't tell is that footsteps themselves became maps. Women remembered where they had stumbled, where a child had fallen, where they had rested with buckets of water balanced on hips. These invisible maps guided them even decades later. Their scars were the inability to forget, each path a story carved into their muscles. I remember my mother stopping mid-walk one day, staring at the ground in silence. She whispered, "I buried a memory here." She didn't explain, but I knew. Her scar was the weight of land itself. Every step reopening ground she wished she could leave untouched. The truth they don't tell is that ashes blurred directions. Women walked in circles through landscapes of grey, every road looking the same, every horizon clouded by smoke. They learned to follow intuition rather than landmarks, to trust silence more than sight. Their scars were the disorientation, the sense of never fully arriving anywhere. I once saw a memorial built from bronze shoes lined along a river. They symbolized those who never returned, footsteps frozen in silence. Standing there, I thought of the women who walked endlessly through ash, their journeys unrecorded, their paths erased by time. Their scars were in the invisibility of their movement, footsteps that history refused to follow. The truth they don't tell is that some women never stopped walking, even after the war. They paced kitchens, wandered fields, moved restlessly as though the ash still clung. Their bodies could not forget the rhythm of exile, the cadence of survival. Their scars were not only in where they walked, but in the inability to rest. The ashes in their footsteps remind us that survival is not only about arrival. It's about moving forward when the ground itself resists, when every step erases and remembers at once. Women bore this scar in their souls, in their restless bodies, in the silent maps written beneath their feet. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they kept walking anyway. Not because the road was clear, but because standing still meant surrender. And though forgotten, their footsteps remain in memory, echoing through ash, carrying life forward across fields of ruin. The ashes in their silence after war. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that ashes do not disappear when peace arrives. Armistices may silence the guns, treaties may draw new lines across maps, reconstruction may raise new buildings, but in women's bodies, ashes remained. They lingered in throats that refused to sing, in lungs that coughed at night, in jars hidden behind drawers, in habits no one else understood. I remember my grandmother at the dinner table, decades after the war had ended. She would always save crumbs, wrapping them in a cloth, tucking them into her pocket. When asked why, she simply said, "Because there might be nothing tomorrow." Her scar was not in hunger anymore, but in the ash that memory had left inside her. The truth they don't tell is that peace was not peace for women. It was survival extended, stretched into new shapes. They still walked roads with invisible ashes clinging to hems, still touched walls that remembered flames, still closed their eyes at night only to wake inside burning dreams. Their scars were not healed by peace. They were only hidden, like smoke seeping through cracks. I once read of a woman who planted a tree outside her rebuilt home. Each spring it blossomed, yet every autumn she raked its fallen leaves into piles and burned them. She stood before the smoke in silence, letting the scent fill her lungs. When asked why, she said, "Because the fire must never be forgotten." Her scar was the ritual of remembering, even when others wanted to forget. Children grew into adults, carrying echoes of ash they had never chosen. They inherited silence, fear of waste, mistrust of laughter. They found themselves saving scraps, avoiding music, waking in the night with nameless dread. Their scars were the continuation of ashes, passed down not through fire itself, but through the women who bore it. The truth they don't tell is that women rebuilt quietly, with ashes still under their nails. They plastered walls, planted gardens, raised children, taught them to read. On the surface they seemed whole, But in the privacy of night, they pressed their faces into pillows and breathed in memories of burning. Their scars were in that double life, one for the world, one for the ash inside. I remember my mother once whispering, "They think peace is the opposite of war." It isn't. Peace is learning to live with ashes. That sentence has stayed with me more than any history book. Her scar was the wisdom of survival, that endings are never clean, that destruction leaves residue in every breath. The truth they don't tell is that history rarely records these ashes. It prefers numbers, treaties, names of generals, victories. It forgets the women who carried dust in their hands, who preserved memory in jars, who sang lullabies broken by smoke. Their scars remain invisible, yet they are the most enduring testimonies of war. I once visited a museum where children's shoes were displayed, their leather cracked, their soles coated faintly in ash. Women had kept them, preserved them, unable to throw them away. Standing there, I realized that survival itself was an archive, not built of stone, but of memory embedded in ordinary things. The scars of women lived in these objects, silent but unshakable. The truth they don't tell is that silence after war was heavier than silence during war. In war, silence meant survival. After war, silence meant erasure. Women told no one of what they had carried, either because they feared disbelief or because they refused to let history consume their pain. Their scars were buried in that refusal, hidden but alive. The ashes in their silence after war remind us that peace is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of forgetting, unless we choose otherwise. Women bore these scars in their hands, in their eyes, in their dreams, in their children. They carried the ashes of war into the very fabric of life that followed. The truth they don't tell about women in war zones is that when the world looked away, they survived. When peace returned, they remained forgotten. But ashes endure, in memory, in silence, in gestures that no treaty can erase. And though history may fail to honor them, their survival speaks louder than fire, louder